the busy worker's handbook to the apocalypse. So I'm going to kind of scroll through and stop when I see something worth calling out. But in general, this first section, I think he does a good job kind of laying the groundwork as an explanation of what is happening in general with climate change. So here we go. He's talking about, okay, 1.7% increase to the total cumulative load, over a certain period of time. If we assume constant future emissions at 2022 levels, it would have, this much in these number of years. Quite an assumption. And he doesn't really talk about his methodology here, or why he's using the methodology that he's using. It's not that big of a deal, except that later on in this piece, he refers back to this, but gives no methodology for why he's using this kind of calculation. He quotes Hansen a lot. And I would recommend anybody reading this to really just go read the James Hansen pieces that have come out recently. The first big problem I have is his section on Arctic ice. He's talking about, okay, decrease in size and thickness. This is all true. I mean, Arctic ice is declining. So we're talking about change in albedo. Okay, right. We definitely need the albedo, or the reflectivity of Arctic sea ice, especially in the spring and summer. So we're talking about the latent heat of melting. It takes all this energy to melt 1 pound of ice, and that same amount of energy, if you put it on just plain water of the same weight, would raise it by 80 degrees Celsius. What we're not talking about here is that when Arctic sea ice actually gets low enough for that to be pertinent, where you actually have like an almost ice-free Arctic, that's happening in late September. In late September, you have little to no incoming solar radiation. The way this makes it seem, the way that it's written, is that okay, as soon as that ice is gone, all of that heat coming from the sun is going to raise that Arctic seawater by an incredible amount, except that can't happen. By the time that the sea ice gets this low, there is literally no incoming solar radiation at the North Pole by September 21st. And as you're kind of going later in the year, it decreases in latitude as far as where you have zero incoming solar radiation. So you're not getting any energy from the sun at this point. This is during the equinox, September 21st. The amount of solar radiation that hits the North Pole, well, it doesn't. You're at Arctic night at that point, polar night, I should say. By the time that you get to solstice, you're not even at the 66 degrees north mark. You're not getting any by that point. It's not going to heat up because there is no source of heat. There could be some heat coming from ocean currents or some remaining stored heat, but by the time you're into the middle and late September, it's already well below freezing in this area, and the ice begins to increase no matter what. So he's predicting an ice-free Arctic summer, or within the next few years. And look at how Arctic sea ice is shaping up currently. We're well above the record minimum. So if we kind of look at our current Arctic sea ice in context, we're at this blue line here. We have quite a few other recent years below that were not blue ocean events. Compare how our current year's June is to previous years, it'd be oh man, this was really bad down here, and it's actually been increasing since then. Well, actually, our trend line is still long-term going down, but we have been kind of increasing in the past few years. I was looking back at the an article from the 2012 minimum, and we have headlines like Arctic expert predicts final collapse of sea ice within 4 years. And this is a more than 10-year-old article. Peter Wadhams was saying that the danger is that once we do get a blue ocean event, in mid to late September, okay, then maybe if they start creeping into August, then we'll have enough of the year that the sea can, gather more heat from that remaining waning incoming solar radiation. The sea ice forms later and later, and that will happen over time, but we're not talking in the next few years. All right, so we're talking about, okay, modern civilization is going to collapse. When that happens, the aerosol masking effect will end immediately, and an already catastrophic situation will become orders of magnitude worse within a single year, and increase as much as a full 1 degree Celsius right away. Now, this is something that I covered already, where McPherson was citing this article saying that things will result in a degree Celsius of additional warming and saying that it's going to be happening right away. What this actual research says is by the end of the 21st century. And we're talking about a dramatic emission reduction of 35 to 80%, the kind of collapse that our author is talking about. And if you look at the way that aerosols function in the atmosphere, if you look at, like current aerosol concentrations, you'll see that they're not uniform globally, and that there are so many more factors. Like, let's say if we're talking about a reduction in aerosols in an urban area, well, that reduction in aerosols due to a decline in industrial activity is probably going to be counteracted by a lack of urban heat island effect. There are so many more variables in play here. And so we can kind of skip over a lot of this. Geoengineering, I agree, bad idea. What does the IPCC say? Not not as much alarm as we should have, but again, we all understand that they're kind of a business as usual organization. Doesn't mean that they're not doing anything. Okay, so then we're talking about committed warming. He's got kind of like, just another big unsupported assumption here that this IPCC scenario is the only one that allows them to have living humans at the end of this century. Again, that's your interpretation, dude. That's not what the scientists are saying, even if they are kind of BAU or business as usual scientists. Carbon dioxide removal, I agree. Not going to happen. Decarbonizing, not going to happen voluntarily. I agree that this green transition is not really scalable. We're going to get past the Davos conspiracizing distractions. We're talking about it's going to make Earth unlivable within the lifetimes of most of us alive today. Again, who is most? I mean, this is just using some extreme language with the purpose of scaring somebody. I agree, this is a very important paper that Hansen published. It's still under review, so let's kind of not get too on board with that until it's been seen by some more eyes. Again, please do read Hansen's paper. It says, so far, if we do some simple projections based off what we know so far, we're looking at 1.5 by 24. So who is we? Who is we that are doing these projections? These are based off of, I don't know, it's not based off of any of this data that he is using here. Because none of them say anything about these projections. These are his and his alone. He's talking about being exacerbated in the northern hemisphere because land warms faster, but land also cools faster and water stores heat better. That's kind of basic continentality there. Again, and these are things that we're basing these off of his earlier assumptions of a 1.7% growth. I think that was annual growth. More like the temperature projections that he just made are a simplistic representation. Again, the source is just yourself. Like, these are your own projections based on no scientific training. Here he's talking about aerosol cooling effect could be 0.5 to 1 degree within 1 to 2 years. It's a little bit different from what he said earlier. This whole thing about plankton being gone, this article was fully debunked. And the author of that article is talking about 80% of all insects already being wiped out, 100% be gone in 20 years. Really, actually where I live, it's a cooler than normal summer, and we actually have way more insects than usual. Climate change is not uniform. Collapse is not uniform. So that's really worth mentioning. And then we're getting into this kind of like social predictions that are really definitely based on perspective. Like, we're talking about, okay, the US government is preparing for climate change by hiring 100,000 additional police officers. Well, it's implying that the government is doing this because of climate change. I mean, that's not really why. And the federal government does not directly hire local or state or county, whatever, police officers. I mean, that's not a federal thing. These are not federal cops. But definitely, he does point out some things about an increasingly militarized government, which I'm not going to disagree with, but it's not really my area of expertise. So, okay, we've got a comma splice there. It says the U.S. just created the largest ever recorded methane release by blowing up Nord Stream pipelines. Did we? I mean, that's very, very much disputed, depending on who you ask. Again, we're starting to get into kind of conspiracist type of stuff. And then we're talking about research showing the U.S. military being one of the largest climate polluters in history. It's like, we were talking about, a militarized government, not necessarily how it relates to pollution. I mean, that's true, but it's not really related to the topic of this paragraph, which is kind of like all over the place to begin with. He's talking about that we're actually in a civil war right now. It's like, I'm not sure. Again, this is really just kind of like his own social take. We're talking about there's zero chance of developing any meaningful climate resiliency and significant odds of sharp escalation of violent repression. It's like, how do you know this? How are you defining climate resiliency, first of all? Are you talking about on a national or local or regional scale? Like, he doesn't say. We're talking about we have zero resiliency. That's another big assumption. Maybe where he lives, people have very minimal resiliency, but that's not an accurate representation of how people are in the rest of the world. It varies from one place to another. We can't make these big blanket statements about people that we don't know and that we don't know about. So he's talking about, okay, loss of power grids, refugee wars, civilizational collapse. He's saying that these are what we have to look forward to, and these are all of the absolute worst case scenarios that he's assuming are all going to happen like simultaneously. Again, this is just the language of fear, and he's really trying to scare the reader, but I'm not really sure as to the goal. And so he's got some more quotes from people that support his biases. Conclusion, it's simpler than you think. No, climate change is not simpler than we've been led to believe. It's far more complex, and there are far more variables than are acknowledged here. And the interplay between those variables is something that he's not getting here. He's saying that there will not be a revolution. I'm saying revolution is not the only path to change. He's talking about big, grand-scale revolutions to overthrow governments and things, and that's not the only path to change. Why don't scientists agree? He basically is saying that scientists are idiots, which is funny because he's already quoted a bunch of them to prove his point. He's talking about they don't know, it's outside their realm of expertise. I don't ask a climate scientist how living systems are going to respond to it, but he's making these claims, but how many actual scientists does he know? I know a lot of scientists, and none of this is true. People are not as siloed as he assumes, but that does, again, support his biases. And here he uses this piece by Chomsky saying that geopolitics can be understood by an ordinary 15-year-old. And he's using that as a way of saying that, oh, I don't actually have to study climate science to analyze its effects. But climate science is not geopolitics. It's very different. Basically, he's using this to say, like, you can trust my analysis, but I certainly do not trust his analysis. So he's talking about, oh, our cultural overemphasis on credentialism undermines interdisciplinary analysis and critical thinkers a challenge status quo. He's so daring. Only this guy can put it all together and give it to you. So my summary, there's a decent primer in climate change, but really you should just read Hansen and the other scientists themselves. But he does give you a very good background. His analyses are not always supported by the data. He leaves out their analysis of the data and then replaces it with his own. And he focuses on worst case scenarios. We've got a lot of broad and unsupported assumptions. So what I'm saying is that this is his perspective. And there is a lot of good foundational stuff, but all of the fear-mongering, it's basically his perspectives. But where he lives is not where you live. Like I was saying, like where I live, we're having a cooler than normal summer. We have more insects than anybody has ever seen here in decades. We notice that the Arctic sea ice is not really decreasing at any more of a rapid rate than usual. But things may be bad where he is, maybe socially and environmentally. And how are things where you are, and how does that compare with this guy? I mean, they may be better, they may be worse. If you live in like Phoenix or Miami, you might be thinking things are even worse than this author, and you'd probably be right. I would not want to be in Phoenix or Miami. So I'm saying, in general, I agree with a lot of what's in here. Things are bad and getting worse, unlikely to get better in a global sense. Even on a local level, in the most ideal locales, things will get worse, maybe just not as dramatically. Human extinction is even likely in the near term relative to what it might have been otherwise, which could have been like hundreds of thousands or even millions of years. It's going to be probably shortened to thousands. But we're not talking years or decades. We're not talking about something that you should be freaking out about right now. You should be, instead, begin contracting. Like, for example, I have more than one dog. One of them is very old. When he dies, I'm not going to replace him. That's contracting, right? We're going to degrow, right? We're talking about degrowth. We need to rewild what we can, fight for remaining wilderness and intact ecosystems, increase your own resilience, consume less, produce more. Grow potatoes, seriously. You can grow them in any climate. In hot climates, they're good wintertime, easy to save your seeds. Fantastic thing to start doing, just in general. I mean, everybody knows what we should be doing, but every fraction of a degree is important. And I'm saying be kind. There's already enough suffering in the world because, we don't need to be exporting our fear and anger and hopelessness to other people when they may be in a different place than you. They may be in a place where things are not as hopeless. So I'm just saying that, yeah, there's a good primer here, but most of what you see in this is not really supported by what the scientists themselves, who are doing the research, are saying. That's what this guy is saying. And he's intentionally interpreting things in the absolute worst case scenarios. I'm not sure why he's trying to scare everybody. It kind of bothers me because, like I said, every fraction of a degree counts, and I care about the mental health and well-being of my fellow doomers. Thank you for listening.